My best friend's dad caught me off guard at the lake. The summer I turned 18 was supposed to be about preparing for college, relaxing with friends, and savoring my last taste of freedom. But life had other plans. At my best friend Jake's family lake cabin, everything changed, especially when his dad Ryan caught me in a moment I'll never forget. What would you have done in my place? Stay tuned to find out how it all unfolded. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the rest of this story. Turning 18 felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into a future filled with possibilities and uncertainty. I was leaving my small town in Ohio for college at the end of the summer, and it felt like my whole life was about to change. Jake, my best friend since middle school, had invited me to spend a few weeks at his family's lake cabin. It was our tradition, a final hurrah before the weight of adulthood came crashing down. The cabin was tucked away in the heart of the Adirondacks, surrounded by dense woods and sitting right on the edge of a pristine lake. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where the world felt smaller and simpler. Jake's family had always been welcoming. His mom, Lisa, was sweet and a little overprotective, always baking cookies or fussing over us. His dad, Ryan, was the opposite. Calm, collected, and incredibly charismatic. Ryan wasn't like most dads. At 42, he had a rugged charm that made people naturally gravitate toward him. He ran a construction business, so he was always tan, strong, and had this air of confidence that made you want to listen whenever he spoke. To me, he had always just been Jake's dad, a cool guy who treated me like part of the family. When Jake invited me, I didn't hesitate to say yes. The cabin was a sanctuary, a place where we could escape from everything. Jake and I spent our days kayaking, swimming, and hiking trails that wound through the forest. It felt like nothing could go wrong there, but even as we laughed and reminisced about our childhood, I couldn't shake the feeling that this summer was different. The first time I noticed it was when Ryan and I were chatting after dinner one night. Jake had gone into town with his mom to pick up groceries, leaving me and Ryan alone at the cabin. I was sitting on the porch swing, staring out at the lake as the sun set, when Ryan joined me with 2 beers in hand. "You're 18 now," he said with a grin, handing me one. "Figured you could handle this." I laughed nervously, not used to drinking around adults. "Thanks." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds coming from the rustling leaves and the occasional splash of fish jumping in the lake. "You've grown a lot since the first time you came here," Ryan said, breaking the silence. "Hard to believe you're heading off to college soon." "Yeah," I replied, unsure of what else to say. "It feels surreal." Ryan nodded, taking a sip of his beer. "It'll be different, but in a good way. College is where you figure out who you are." His words stuck with me. Something about the way he said it felt personal, like he wasn't just talking about me but about himself too. I wanted to ask him what he meant, but Jake and Lisa returned before I could. Over the next few days, little things began to stand out. Ryan's glances seemed to linger a second longer than before. He laughed a little too warmly at my jokes. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that it was just my nerves about leaving for college making me overanalyze everything. Then came the day Jake left for a weekend trip with his mom to tour a college he was considering. It was just me and Ryan at the cabin. That Saturday afternoon, I decided to go for a swim while Ryan worked on fixing the dock. The lake was calm, its surface shimmering under the midday sun. I swam out to the floating platform anchored a few yards from the shore and lay back, letting the sun warm my skin. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I heard Ryan calling my name. "You all right out there?" His voice carried across the water, concerned but steady. "Yeah," I called back, sitting up and shading my eyes to see him better. "You've been out there a while," he said. "Thought you might have fallen asleep." "I'm fine," I replied. though I felt a little embarrassed. Ryan smiled and shook his head before turning back to the dock. But as I watched him work, something inside me shifted. I couldn't explain it, but there was a heaviness in my chest, a confusion I didn't know how to process. I stayed on the platform, lost in thought, until the sun began to dip below the horizon. When I finally swam back to shore, Ryan was waiting for me with a towel. "Long swim," he said, handing it to me. "Yeah," I muttered, avoiding his gaze. As I dried off, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was building between us, something I wasn't ready to face. The next morning, the cabin was unusually quiet. With Jake and Lisa gone, it was just Ryan and me. The air felt different, charged with something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. I spent most of the morning wandering the lake's edge, skimming stones and trying to sort through the thoughts swirling in my head. Ryan was on the dock again, repairing loose boards and checking the anchor ropes. His sleeves were rolled up, and I caught myself watching him work more than I cared to admit. He moved with an ease that was captivating, each motion purposeful and precise. I hated how my stomach fluttered when he glanced my way. "You planning to skip breakfast entirely?" Ryan called out, pulling me from my thoughts. I shrugged, smiling awkwardly. I wasn't that hungry. "Well, I'm making lunch in a bit. You're not skipping that," he said firmly, though there was a playful lilt in his voice. I nodded, grateful for the distraction. The cabin was small, with a modest kitchen that felt cozier than cramped. When I walked inside, Ryan was already slicing vegetables for sandwiches. "Grab a plate," he said, gesturing to the counter. I did as he asked, but the silence between us felt heavier than usual. I wasn't sure if it was me overthinking or if he felt it too, that unspoken tension lingering just below the surface. "You all right?" Ryan asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. I looked up, startled. "Yeah? Why?" "You've been quieter than usual," he said, his green eyes locking onto mine. "Something on your mind?" I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "Just thinking about college," I lied. Ryan nodded slowly, as if he didn't quite believe me, but wasn't going to push. "It's normal to feel a little lost," he said, his tone softer now. "Big changes do that to you." His words hung in the air, resonating more than they should have. There was a vulnerability in his voice that I wasn't used to hearing, and it made me want to ask questions I wasn't ready to face. After lunch, Ryan suggested we take the boat out on the lake. It seemed like a good way to clear my head, so I agreed. The small motorboat was old, but reliable, its engine sputtering to life as Ryan steered us away from the shore. The lake stretched out in every direction, its surface like glass beneath the midday sun. We drifted for a while, neither of us saying much. It should have been relaxing, but the silence only amplified my thoughts. "Ever think about what you really want?" Ryan asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. I frowned, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "In life," he said, keeping his eyes on the horizon. "What you want to do, who you want to be." I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I don't know," I admitted. "I guess I've always just gone with the flow." Ryan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's scary to ask yourself those questions," he said, "but it's worth it." There was something about the way he said it, something that made my chest tighten. He wasn't just talking about me. I could tell. He was speaking from experience, from a place of knowing what it felt like to wrestle with those doubts. As we floated in the middle of the lake, the tension between us felt palpable. It wasn't just in the words we spoke, but in the spaces between them, in the glances we shared. I didn't know what to do with it, didn't know how to interpret what was happening. When we got back to the cabin, the sun was starting to dip below the trees. Ryan suggested we light a fire in the pit by the lake, and I agreed. The flames cast flickering shadows as we sat in silence, the crackle of burning wood filling the space between us. "Do you ever feel like you're not sure who you are?" I asked suddenly, the words spilling out before I could stop them. Ryan looked at me, his expression unreadable. "More often than you'd think," he said quietly. Our eyes met, and for a moment, it felt like the world had stopped. There was something in his gaze that I couldn't ignore. A mix of understanding and something deeper, something that made my pulse quicken. I wanted to say more, to ask him what he was thinking, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, we sat there, the firelight dancing between us, as the weight of the moment pressed down on me. The morning after the fire pit conversation, I woke to the smell of coffee and bacon drifting through the cabin. For a moment, the warmth of the sun streaming through the window and the distant sound of birdsong made it easy to forget the restless thoughts that had plagued me the night before. But as I walked into the kitchen and saw Ryan standing at the stove, his back to me, it all came rushing back. "Morning," he said without turning around, his voice calm and even. "Mornin'," I replied, trying to sound casual. He glanced over his shoulder and smiled, a small, genuine curve of his lips that made my stomach tighten in a way I couldn't quite explain. "Breakfast will be ready in a minute. Hope you're hungry today." I nodded, sitting at the small wooden table as he finished plating the food. We ate in relative silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Ryan had a way of filling the space without speaking, as if his presence alone was enough. I found myself studying him again. The lines of his face, the way his hands moved, steady and deliberate. After breakfast, he suggested we hike one of the trails that wound through the woods behind the cabin. It was a path I knew well, but this time it felt different. The air was thick with humidity, and the sound of our footsteps on the dirt trail seemed louder than usual. Ryan walked ahead of me, his pace slow and steady, and I couldn't help but notice how his broad shoulders shifted under his shirt with every step. About halfway up the trail, we came to a clearing with a small overlook that offered a stunning view of the lake. Ryan stopped, leaning against a tree and gesturing for me to sit on a nearby rock. "Pretty amazing, huh?" he said, his voice low. "Yeah," I replied, looking out at the water. The sunlight sparkled on the surface, and for a moment, it felt like we were the only two people in the world. Ryan sat beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his arm brushing against mine. "You've been quiet again," he said, his tone softer now. "You sure everything's okay?" I hesitated, the words caught in my throat. How could I explain what I was feeling when I didn't even understand it myself? "I'm fine," I said finally, though it felt like a lie. "You don't have to pretend with me, you know," he said, turning to look at me. "I've been where you are, feeling like you're stuck between who you've always been and who you're supposed to be." His words hit me harder than I expected, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. There was something so raw and honest in the way he spoke, something that made me feel like he saw right through me. "I don't know who I'm supposed to be," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Ryan nodded, his gaze steady. "That's okay. Most people don't, but you've got time to figure it out." The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable. I could feel the weight of his presence beside me, the subtle tension in the air that neither of us seemed willing to address. As we sat there, the sun dipping lower in the sky, I found myself wishing the moment could last forever. But then Ryan stood, brushing the dirt off his hands. "We should head back before it gets dark," he said, his voice steady once again. As we made our way down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. The lines that had always seemed so clear, between respect and admiration, between friendship and something more, were starting to blur, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to stop it. When we reached the cabin, Ryan suggested we go for a swim to cool off. The lake was calm, the water reflecting the orange and pink hues of the setting sun. We swam in silence for a while, the cool water a welcome relief from the heat of the day. But as I floated on my back, staring up at the sky, I felt Ryan's gaze on me. "You're quiet again," he said, his voice breaking through the stillness. "I'm just thinking," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. "About what?" I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "About everything." Ryan swam closer, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," he said, "but you don't have to face it alone either." His words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. I wanted to ask him what he meant, but before I could, he turned and swam toward the shore, leaving me alone in the middle of the lake with my racing thoughts. The next morning started quietly, but the air between us felt charged with unspoken tension. Ryan seemed distant, or maybe I was imagining it. I couldn't decide if I wanted to avoid him entirely, or if the thought of being alone with him again made my heart race in a way I wasn't ready to admit. He was on the porch, fixing the screen door, when he called out, "Hey, you want to help me with something in the shed?" "Sure," I replied, trying to sound casual. The shed sat a few yards behind the cabin, its wooden frame weathered and overgrown with ivy. It was dim inside, the sunlight filtering through cracks in the walls. Ryan was rummaging through a toolbox, muttering something about finding the right wrench. I stood awkwardly near the door, unsure of what to do. "You can come in," he said without looking up, his voice steady. "I don't bite." I forced a nervous laugh and stepped inside, the air heavy with the scent of wood and metal. "What are we fixing?" "The dock," he said, pulling out a hammer and some nails. "It's been wobbling a bit. Thought we'd get it done before Jake and Lisa get back." "Sounds good," I said, eager for a task to keep my hands and my thoughts busy. We carried the tools to the dock where the sun was already high in the sky. It was hot, the kind of sticky heat that clung to your skin. Ryan worked shirtless, his muscles flexing with each swing of the hammer. I tried not to stare, but my eyes kept betraying me. "You all right?" he asked suddenly, catching me off guard. "Yeah," I said quickly, looking away, "just tired." He smirked, as if he knew more than he was letting on. "If you say so." We worked in silence for a while, the sound of hammering filling the air. When we finally finished, Ryan leaned back, wiping sweat from his brow. "Not bad for a day's work," he said, glancing at me. "You did good." "Thanks," I muttered, feeling a strange mix of pride and discomfort under his gaze. "Feel like cooling off?" he asked, nodding toward the lake. "Yeah, sure," I said, grateful for the chance to escape the heat and the thoughts swirling in my head. We dove into the water, the coolness a welcome relief. For a while it felt normal, just two people enjoying a swim. But as we floated near the dock, the tension that had been building all week seemed to bubble to the surface. "You've been quiet again," Ryan said, his voice softer now. "I guess I've just had a lot on my mind," I admitted, my heart pounding. "Like what?" he asked, his green eyes locking onto mine. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "Just everything," I said vaguely. Ryan swam closer, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," he said, echoing his words from the day before. "But you should be honest with yourself." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He was quiet for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes we spend so much time worrying about what other people think that we forget to ask ourselves what we want." His words hit me like a wave, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. There was something in the way he looked at me, something that made my chest tighten and my mind race. I wanted to say something, to ask him what he meant, but the words wouldn't come. The silence between us stretched, heavy and charged. Then, without warning, Ryan reached out, his hand brushing against my arm. It was a small gesture, barely more than a touch, but it sent a shockwave through me. "You're overthinking again," he said quietly, his voice steady but soft. I opened my mouth to reply, but before I could, he turned and swam back toward the shore, leaving me alone in the water with my heart pounding in my chest. That evening, the cabin was quiet again, the kind of silence that amplifies every thought and emotion. I stayed on the porch, staring out at the lake as the sun disappeared behind the trees. Ryan joined me not long after, 2 glasses of iced tea in hand. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his voice calm, as if nothing about the day had been unusual. "Of course," I replied, shifting to make room. For a while, neither of us said anything. The sound of crickets filled the air, and the breeze carried the faint scent of pine. It felt peaceful, but the tension between us lingered like a weight neither of us could ignore. "You've got a lot going on in your head," Ryan said finally, his tone gentle. "I can see it." I hesitated, unsure of how much to share. "I guess I just feel lost," I admitted, the words surprising even myself. "Like, I don't know who I'm supposed to be." Ryan nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "That's part of growing up," he said. "But sometimes, it's not about figuring out who you're supposed to be, it's about being okay with who you are right now." His words hit harder than I expected, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. There was something raw and vulnerable in what he said, something that made me feel seen in a way I wasn't ready for. "I don't know if I'm ready to do that," I said quietly. Ryan turned to look at me then, his green eyes searching mine. "No one's ever ready," he said. "But you don't have to do it alone." The weight of his words hung in the air, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. I wanted to say something, to break the tension, but before I could, Ryan stood. "I'll leave you to think," he said, his voice soft. Then, with one last lingering glance, he disappeared into the cabin, leaving me alone with the thoughts I wasn't sure how to face. The next morning, the air felt lighter, as if the storm that had been building all week had finally passed. Ryan was already on the dock when I woke up, sitting with his feet dangling over the edge and a cup of coffee in hand. For the first time, I wasn't nervous to join him. "Morning," I said, sitting beside him. "Morning," he replied, offering a small smile. For a while, we just sat there, the sound of the water lapping against the dock filling the silence. It felt peaceful, natural, like we'd both finally settled into whatever this was. "I've been thinking about what you said," I started, my voice quieter than I intended. Ryan turned to look at me, his expression soft but serious. "And you're right," I admitted. "I've been so caught up in what I think I should be that I haven't given myself permission to just be." Ryan nodded, his gaze steady. "It's not easy, but it's worth it." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that felt grounding. For the first time, I felt like I could breathe. We spent the rest of the day in quiet companionship, talking about everything and nothing. There was no tension, no pressure, just 2 people finding connection in a way neither of us had expected. As the sun set over the lake, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I realized something. This summer hadn't just been about preparing for college or saying goodbye to childhood. It had been about learning to trust myself, to embrace the parts of me I'd been too afraid to face. Ryan turned to me as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the trees. "You'll figure it out," he said, his voice steady. "You've got more courage than you think." Life doesn't always go as planned, but sometimes it's the unexpected moments that teach us the most. How would you handle a summer that changed everything? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories that will leave you thinking long after they end.